I had been on the road for over 6 hours. The plan was simple: leave Flagstaff early, follow Route 66, and reach Oatman before nightfall, where my friends would already be waiting for a laid-back weekend. But as the sun set, I realized the trip was taking longer than expected. My eyes were getting heavy, and driving at night on that empty road didn't seem as appealing anymore. That's when I saw the flickering sign, a roadside motel. Some letters were burnt out, the neon barely glowing. It looked old, one of those places that had probably seen better days, but it would be enough for the night. Without giving it much thought, I pulled into the empty parking lot. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, didn't pay me much attention. He just tossed a key onto the counter and muttered that I'd be the only guest. I grabbed the key and headed to the room. It was what I expected: simple, old, but functional. The faded carpet and yellowed walls didn't bother me. All I wanted was to rest before continuing the trip. In the room, I kicked off my shoes, tossed my backpack in the corner, and lay down on the bed. The outdated decor and musty smell didn't really matter. The exhaustion was stronger. All I wanted was to sleep for a few hours and continue my trip the next day. The place was quiet. Maybe a little too quiet. The only light came from a small lamp next to the bed, barely lighting up the room. The calm didn't last long. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a noise coming from the room next door. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I remembered the receptionist's words, "You're the only guest tonight?" That struck me as odd, but I tried to ignore it, figuring it could be the old plumbing or just the building itself, which seemed pretty old. But the noise didn't stop. First, heavy footsteps, moving back and forth like someone was slowly and deliberately pacing. Then, the sound of something scraping against the wall. I started to get uneasy, trying to figure out where the sounds were coming from. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the noises seemed to be getting closer, as if something was happening right there on the other side. The sounds didn't stop. By now there was no way to ignore them. I was fully awake, my ears straining to catch every noise. There were whispers. Low, muffled, but definitely there. I got up from the bed and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it to listen more closely. The sound was real. It sounded like a conversation, but I couldn't make out any words. What was strange, though, was that according to the receptionist, I was the only guest. It started to really bother me. I decided to step out of the room and check the hallway. The door creaked as I opened it, and I was met with a completely empty corridor, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb at the far end. I walked the length of the hallway. Nothing. No sounds, no one in sight. I returned to my room, but the moment I stepped inside, something was off. The lamp beside the bed had shifted. I was sure I'd left it closer to the corner. I glanced at the curtains, slightly open, not the way I'd left them. That growing sense of unease tightened around me, and that's when I noticed it, behind the TV, a small hidden camera, angled directly at the bed. It all clicked in an instant. I was being watched, and fear began to creep in. The shock of finding the camera froze me for a few seconds. I looked around, trying to understand how I hadn't noticed it before. And now, everything made sense. The sounds, the whispers, the lamp out of place. I had been watched the entire time. A rising fear gripped me, and the only thought that came to mind was to get out of there. I rushed to the door, but when I tried to turn the handle, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder, but nothing. The door was locked from the outside. A suffocating panic began to take over. I ran to the window, but as I tried to open it, I realized it was stuck as well. I was trapped. I heard footsteps in the hallway, much closer this time. Someone was approaching. Fear drove me back into the corner of the room, my mind racing to find an escape. I glanced out the window and saw the receptionist's car, its lights on. He was there, probably watching everything unfold. I felt cornered, with no way out, and the situation was only getting worse. It was as if every movement I made was being controlled, every reaction watched. I needed to act fast, but it felt like everything was working against me in that moment. My heart was racing, and every second trapped in that room felt like an eternity. The window wouldn't open, the door was locked. I had to think fast. That's when I remembered the landline phone on top of the dresser. Wasting no time, I rushed over, my hands trembling as I dialed 911. The voice of the police dispatcher answered, and I explained what was happening, trying to keep calm. I'm trapped in a motel on Route 66. I found a hidden camera in the room. I think someone's watching me. The receptionist, he's outside. Please send someone. The dispatcher urged me to stay calm and assured me that a patrol car was being sent immediately. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. I could hear slow, heavy footsteps in the hallway, as if someone was out there, waiting for the right moment to enter. I crouched in the corner of the room, trying to be as quiet as possible, waiting for the police to arrive. All I could think about was how a simple stop at a motel had turned into a nightmare. I had no idea what those employees were planning, but I felt like I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Now, it was just a matter of time before the police arrived. Finally, I heard sirens in the distance. A wave of relief rushed through my body. The footsteps in the hallway suddenly stopped and silence filled the air. Within minutes, the flashing lights of the patrol cars lit up the motel parking lot. I heard loud knocks on the door and the commanding voices of the police. They got me out of the room and quickly went after the staff. After a brief investigation, they found hidden cameras in every room. The receptionist and several other employees were arrested. I was free, but the unsettling feeling of having been watched for hours still lingered. That weekend was one I would never forget. I had been driving for a few hours. We'd left New York earlier that evening, but the traffic was brutal. The plan was to reach Philadelphia by around 9, but it was clear that wasn't happening. The road was empty now, which was a relief after all the chaos of the city. Anna was asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, and I was doing my best to ignore how tired I was. We still had about an hour to go. That kind of silence was setting in, you know? Just the hum of the engine and the occasional distant car passing by. I decided it would be a good idea to stop somewhere for a coffee and take a quick break. I didn't want to arrive at our romantic weekend completely drained. When I saw the sign for a diner at the next exit, I figured it'd be the perfect spot for a quick stop. As soon as I pulled off the highway and stepped into the small diner, I could tell something was off. It wasn't anything obvious really, just a roadside diner like any other. But the place was almost completely empty, except for one guy sitting at the counter. He had his back to me, but you could tell he was one of those solitary types. The server didn't seem too interested in working either. I ordered a quick coffee and headed to the bathroom while Anna still slept in the car. When I came back, I noticed the guy at the counter had turned, staring in our direction. He didn't look away. That's when I started to feel an unease I couldn't quite explain. I convinced myself it was all in my head, maybe just the lack of sleep or the exhaustion from the drive. I grabbed my coffee, paid the server, and quickly left with this growing sense of urgency, like I shouldn't stick around too long. When I got back to the car, Anna was still groggy. I told her the stop had been quick, and we decided to hit the road again before it got too late. But as soon as I walked around and got to the driver's door, I noticed the tire was completely flat. I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out how it had happened. The road had been smooth and I didn't recall hitting any potholes or debris. It didn't make sense. Anna noticed the flat tire too and got out of the car, still looking half asleep, asking what had happened. I could only shake my head, just as confused. That's when the guy from the diner appeared. He had walked out right after us, approaching with a smile that I couldn't quite read. It wasn't a friendly smile. He offered to help, saying he could take us to a nearby station. The way he said it, a little too persistent, made me uneasy. I thanked him, trying to be polite, but declined the offer. I knew how to change a tire and figured I could handle it quickly. But then when I went to grab the jack from the trunk, it wasn't there. That's when I really started to worry. I couldn't remember if I had forgotten to put it in or if it had somehow gone missing. With no other option, I tried calling roadside assistance. And of course, no cell signal. The tension started to build. I was really starting to feel uncomfortable with the whole situation. The tire going flat out of nowhere, the jack missing, and that guy still hanging around close enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. He didn't back off. He kept standing just a few meters from us, offering his help in that insistent, almost intrusive way, as if he was trying to force us to accept. Anna, now fully awake, was getting nervous. She suggested we should look for help somewhere else, but we couldn't go anywhere with the car in that condition. My only option seemed to be driving with the flat tire until we could find a gas station. I knew it could damage the car, but at that point it felt like the least of my worries. The man kept insisting, saying the nearest station was too far for us to drive like that. I decided to take the risk. I got back into the car, started the engine, and began to move slowly, even with the tire scraping against the asphalt. That's when he made his move. Before I could accelerate, he jumped into his car, parked just ahead, and blocked our path. He stopped right in front of us, cutting off any chance of us leaving. My heart was pounding. I knew the situation was spiraling out of control and I had to act fast. There was no way to reverse, no way to get out. That guy clearly had other intentions. What did he want? I still didn't know, but it was obvious that it wasn't anything good. In that moment, I didn't think about anything except getting out of there. I didn't care what would happen to the car anymore. All that mattered was putting distance between us and that man. He was still sitting in his car, blocking the road, his headlights glaring straight at us. Anna was panicking and I wasn't far from it either, but I had to keep my cool. I took a deep breath, gripped the steering wheel, and decided to hit the gas. It wasn't the best option, but it was the only one I had. I forced the car toward his, banking on the hope that he wasn't crazy enough to ram us head-on. When he realized I was serious, he swerved at the last second, pulling out of the way. The adrenaline surged through me as I pressed down harder on the accelerator, trying to block out the horrible sound of the shredded tire dragging against the pavement. The road was dark, with no other cars in sight. With every turn, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his headlights chasing us down. But by some miracle, he wasn't there anymore. A few miles later, we finally spotted the lights of a gas station. I'd never felt such relief in my life. When we pulled in, there was no sign of him. We rushed into the convenience store, called the police, and explained everything that had happened. The officers searched the area, but as expected, the man was long gone. Even so, the feeling of safety didn't return until we were back on the road, putting more and more miles between us and that place. Even though everything seemed calm now, the fear still lingered. Long after the danger had passed, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting his car to appear out of nowhere. He might not ever be caught, but one thing was certain. I'd never forget that stop on the empty highway. I needed a break. Between work, traffic, and the suffocating routine of San Francisco, it felt like years since I had truly been able to breathe. So, I decided to take the weekend for myself. Lake Tahoe seemed like the perfect destination. Tranquility, nature, and a bit of isolation. I hit the road in the mid-afternoon, planning to arrive before sunset, and the drive was as smooth as I could have hoped. As I got closer to the lake, the view was exactly what I needed. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. The calm waters reflected the surrounding mountains, creating an immediate sense of peace. My cabin was situated in a more secluded area, near the Nevada border. The kind of place where you don't see many people, exactly what I was looking for. When I parked the car, I noticed there weren't many vehicles around, just a black SUV a few meters away. I didn't think much of it. Maybe it belonged to someone fishing nearby or enjoying the scenery. I entered the cabin, dropped my bags in the bedroom, and began to get ready for a night of pure relaxation. After tidying up my things, I went straight to the kitchen to prepare something quick to eat. Nothing fancy, just a sandwich and a glass of juice. As the knife sliced through the bread, my mind began to wander. The silence around me was profound, but not exactly the kind of silence that soothes you. It was strange, different from what I had imagined. I walked over to the kitchen window, more out of curiosity than anything else. There was the SUV in the same spot as before, parked a few meters away from my cabin. I still hadn't seen anyone exit it. At first, I didn't think much of it, but something started to bother me. It seemed like the car hadn't moved since I arrived, as if it was just there for no apparent reason. I looked away, trying to ignore the unease, but the feeling wouldn't let me be. I reached into my pocket to grab my phone. No signal. Of course, that was to be expected in such an isolated place. I sighed and went back to the sofa, trying to distract myself with a book I had brought, but the thought of that SUV kept nagging at me. Maybe it was just exhaustion. I was probably overreacting, right? Time dragged on as I tried to focus on the book, but I couldn't stop thinking about the SUV. It didn't make any sense. Maybe I should take another look just to reassure myself, so I went to the living room window. To my surprise, the car was still there, motionless, as if no one had left or even touched it since I arrived. I returned to the sofa, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. I was almost convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me when I heard a sound. Low but unmistakable, footsteps on the porch. The sound was clear enough to make me freeze for a second. I tried not to think the worst, but it wasn't easy. No one should be out there. I slowly stood up, my heart racing faster now. I walked to the front door with light steps, trying to make no noise. I pressed my ear against the wood, hoping it was just the wind or some animal, but there it was again. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, like someone pacing back and forth right in front of the door. I looked through the small living room window once more, hoping to see something, but all I saw was the SUV. This time, the interior light was on, and there was no one outside. The feeling of discomfort grew, but I tried to push the thoughts away. Maybe I was just too tired, who knows? But the footsteps continued. That's when I heard the doorknob turning very slowly, as if someone was testing the door. My heart was racing, and every second felt like an eternity. The doorknob stopped turning, but I knew whoever was out there was still nearby. I couldn't stay there frozen. I needed to get out fast. I looked toward the back window. It was my only chance. I approached it cautiously, trying to make no noise. The area was completely dark, except for the headlights of the SUV, which still illuminated part of the cabin. I opened the window as quietly as I could and, with a mix of panic and haste, slipped outside. The night air was cold, but my mind could only focus on one thing: running. I sprinted with all the strength I had, trying to stay out of the SUV's line of sight. The sound of each step felt too loud, as if it was betraying my escape. The fear of being seen pushed me forward. I reached the car and, with trembling hands, unlocked the door and threw myself into the driver's seat. The key turned in the ignition, and the engine rumbled to life. I pressed the accelerator and sped away, not looking back. I just wanted to get away as far as possible. I drove non-stop, adrenaline pumping through my veins. The SUV and the footsteps on the porch seemed to be moving away quickly, but the feeling of panic still lingered with me. When I reached the main road, a mix of relief and terror washed over me. Even though the black car disappeared in the rearview mirror, I knew that what I had experienced would leave a lasting mark on me. I arrived at a hotel in Truckee, exhausted and unable to stop thinking. I would never return to that place. This experience, a persistent shadow in my mind, would remind me that hidden dangers exist even in the most peaceful places.